So Andy, I obviously know you a bit, and we've known each other for a little while. But I wonder, could you maybe tell folks who've never heard of you who you are? Who is Andy Bevan?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I'm Andy. Hello, everyone. I'm married to my wife, Charlie. We've been married for, oh gosh, 7.
You're in trouble now.
I'm glad Charlie's not connected to this. For about 7 years. And we have 2 wee kids as well. We've got a wee boy, Harris, who's 4. And a wee girl, Ayla, who is 1.5 years. So they're currently out of the building. So they don't burst in behind me like that BBC, infamous BBC video.
Brilliant. And where are you? Where are you from? And where do you live now?
Yeah, well, grew up in Aberdeen. So my mum and dad are still up in Aberdeen. I grew up going to Bridge of Dawn Baptist Church. So grew up in the Baptist church. I'm not in Aberdeen any longer though. I'm not very far away from most of you, I'm imagining. I live in Leith in Edinburgh, just at the foot of Leith Walk. I'm currently in my bedroom, so I find the ordinary practice for last week quite amusing, making the bed. My wife, unknown to me, decided to change the sheets on our bed this morning and has put on potentially the most psychedelic sheets you can imagine. So feel free to put on some sunglasses if the glare is getting a bit too much. But yeah, so not far away at all, and I hope after lockdown to be able to join you in person at some point, because I'm not far away at all.
Brilliant. And I mean, you went to university, you studied law. What did you do vocationally, and what are you doing now?
Yeah, so I studied law in Dundee back in 2005 to 2009. Got to the end of my law degree and decided I didn't want to be a lawyer.
That's what all the best people do, Andy.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, surprising number of church leaders do that. I then probably did something similar to you as well. I went to Bible college after that. I moved to Belfast and studied at Belfast Bible College for 2 years. And really during that time of immersing myself in the scriptures in a deeper, more intentional way than I've done before, God's heart for justice really stood out in the scriptures. From the start to the end, you see a God who is passionate to engage with those who are victims of injustice. He's passionate for his church to be a people of justice, reflecting something of who he is. So that then kind of got me thinking a little bit again about, okay, maybe do I go into law, do I not? Decided not to go into law, and at that point did an internship with International Justice Mission in Washington, DC, which was a lot of fun. If you've seen The West Wing, it was very similar to that. It was great. And following that, I moved back to Scotland and have been working for IJM for about 6.5 years now.
Brilliant. And so my suspicion is some of us will know what IJM do, and most of us will have no idea. Yeah. So could you maybe just give us a quick, who are IJM, what do you do?
Sure. Yeah, so IJM are the world's largest anti-slavery organization, which is a bit of a miracle in itself that a Christian organization could actually grow to become the world's largest anti-slavery organization. But we work around the world to protect the poor from violence. That violence manifests itself in many different ways in our world, but one of the big issues that we come alongside is this issue of slavery. There's estimated 40.3 million people in our world today who live in slavery. We believe that's wrong. We believe that God didn't make someone to be in slavery and exploited. We believe that God made them for freedom, made them for relationship with God and with others. We believe that kids should go to school, that adults should be able to work and provide for their families. In many parts of the world, that simply just isn't possible. So what IJM is doing is working around the world with justice systems, with the police, with the legal professions, with social services, to ensure that victims are rescued, that survivors are cared for and looked after as they journey back into a life of freedom. Our lawyers take on the case against the perpetrator of the violence to bring justice in the courts. And then our work with the justice system actually brings lasting transformation in how the justice system operates, and therefore will protect people from being victims of violence even before they are. So that's what we're doing around the world.
And it's an amazing work that you guys do. I had the privilege of meeting Gary Haugen, the founder, when he came to Regent one time, and he really does look like a real life action hero.
Yes,
he's like 6 feet tall and like this, and he's got a blonde crew cut. He's like one version of Captain America, right?
Yeah, he's got a grey crew cut now, so that was maybe a few years ago. But
yeah, like 15 years ago. So no, that's great. I think what we'll do, if it's okay with you, maybe at the end you could give us some stuff that we could get the chance to allow people to connect with
Sure.
with IJM. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
I think they might remember it better that way than if we stick it in here. So is that okay?
Sounds good.
Excellent. Do you have anything else you want to say right now?
No, just really thankful for Lewis's prayers earlier in the service as well, because God's obviously put something of the message that I'm going to be sharing on Psalm 10 on your mind, Lewis. So thank you for being responsive to God in that.
Well, I'll tell you what, we're going to have one of our lawyers, Rebecca, is going to read Psalm 10 for us, and then Andy will hand over to you, and you can bring God's word to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Good to know that everybody who's it's the best to take an option to maybe not be a lawyer, so we'll see how long this lasts. And reading today, Psalm 10. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes he devises. He boasts about the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. Your laws are rejected by him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will ever shake me. He swears, no one will ever do me harm. His mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush, he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. Like a lion in cover, he lies in wait. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed, they collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God will never notice. He covers his face and never sees. Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. Victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked man. Call the evildoer to account for his wickedness that would not otherwise be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land. You, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror.
Andy.
Great stuff. Rebecca, thank you for reading our psalm for this morning. Continuing in the series that Porty has been working through over the last few weeks, particularly in the midst of lockdown, we're continuing to focus on the Psalms this morning. And as Rebecca's just read, we're going to focus on Psalm 10. The book of Psalms is a wonderful book of prayer and worship. At IJM, we believe in the power of prayer. And we believe in it so much so that we dedicate an hour of every working day to prayer. Our days start in stillness. At the start of our day, to mark the start of the day, to welcome God into our day, we have a time of stillness where we pray, we worship, we read the scriptures. And at 12:30, just before lunch, we gather as a team for half an hour of prayer. And at the start of every time we gather as a team for prayer, we read a psalm. And we do that for a whole load of different reasons. And one of the reasons we do it is that there is wonderful honesty that is contained within the Psalms. Here in this book of the Bible, we have heroes of the faith, we have key people in the Jewish and the Christian faith who are being honest before God. We have King David, we have Moses writes a few of the Psalms, we have Solomon being honest before God. And the journey of the Psalms in many ways actually reflects the journey of our lives and our experiences that we have throughout life. So as you as a church consider the book of Psalms in this moment that we find ourselves in, and even beyond that, I just encourage you to immerse yourself in the book of Psalms and see it as a really important roadmap for navigating some of the challenges in life. Today's psalm is a psalm of lament, and it's not an easy read. Some of the words that Rebecca has just shared are brutal. It gives a brutal insight to the wicked of our world and issues of injustice in our world. To use Walter Brueggemann's categorization, which I know Glenn used to kind of set the scene for this series, Psalm 10 is a psalm both of disorientation and of reorientation. It cries out to God about the injustice of this world, yet it turns and trusts in God's character and goodness to come alongside the issues of injustice. Of all 150 psalms, about a third of the psalms are psalms of lament. Now, this is really interesting because if you look at the theology and if you look at the practice of the church, I wonder if we could say that a third of the theology and practice of the church has something to do with lament. For example, the songs that we sing at church. I think you'd probably be pushed to find a modern worship song that portrays some of the themes that we've just read in Psalm 10. Maybe a few, but not many. Certainly not a third of the songs that we sing. And perhaps the reason I've been pondering, why this is as I've prepared for today, and perhaps the reason is an incomplete understanding of what we mean by the phrase lament. Lament in popular language or in the language of the world or what you hear on the news is usually narrowly defined. It's usually a synonym for grieving or grumbling. And it doesn't have a huge amount of hope in it, if anything at all. Biblical lament, on the other hand, as seen in this psalm, in the book of Psalms, and elsewhere in Scripture, is different from that. It's a crying out to God that is characterized by hopeful expression of trust in the character, the power, and the grace of God. As I was preparing for this morning, I came across a definition of lament from a biblical scholar, which I really like and have found helpful. It goes like this: lament is a grieving for the present situation. yet acting in the hopeful assurance that God will deliver and redeem. I believe this morning's psalm, and many other psalms for that matter, provide a roadmap for us navigating the cultural moment that we find ourselves in. Whether it's the feelings that many of us, if not all of us, are having when it comes to thinking about the global pandemic of the coronavirus, or whether it's looking at the injustices that are present in our communities and in our world, the Psalms are a really useful tool. The Psalms of Lament are a useful tool for that. So let's turn to just share a couple of thoughts on Psalm 10 itself. As you read Psalm 10, you can quite easily see the dividing mark between the disorientation of the psalm and the reorientation of the psalm. The disorientation comes in the first 2/3, so from verse 1 to verse 11, where the psalmist addresses God with a complaint. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? And as you continue reading those verses, you then, as I mentioned at the start, get this insight into the issue of injustice in our world. So it's a point of disorientation. Secondly, from verse 12 to the end of the psalm, it pivots, it changes to reorientation. And this is where the psalmist puts a request before God and expresses trust in him. He uses these words, "Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God. The Lord is King forever and ever." So let's just spend a few moments considering the disorientation of this psalm and the reorientation of it in a little bit more detail. So firstly, the disorientation. I wonder what things struck you as Rebecca was reading some of those words. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of this psalm. Why, God? Why? Where are you? Perhaps it's memories of a time in your life, potentially even now, where you have the same questions. Why do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself? Or perhaps it's the horrendous treatment of the poor that's portrayed in this passage. Verse 8 says, "They lie in wait near the villages. From ambush, they murder the innocent." Or perhaps it's the hypocrisy of the world that we live in. Why is it, to quote the psalmist, why do the wicked seem to prosper in our world when others do not? So any number of these things might have stood out to you in hearing these words of disorientation. But this morning, I'm also struck that this psalm, although written thousands of years ago, is bang up to date with what happens today in our world. And to illustrate that, I would love to just briefly introduce you to a boy called Kofi. I am going to attempt to share my screen. So bear with me one moment. Oh, I don't know if I can share the PowerPoint. Let me see. Try one last time. Right, I'll share that. Is that coming through there? Great, great. So I'd love to introduce you to Kofi. Kofi was 8, and his life up until this point had not been easy. His dad had tragically died when he was young, and his mum was left to care for him and his siblings. Desperate to provide for his son, Kofi's mum bought into the lie that was told to her by someone who came to her village. This story is exactly like what I just read in verse 8. They lie in wait near villages from ambush to murder the innocent. He lied to Kofi's mum. He said that this would be his chance to go to school. But instead, this man was a fisherman, and he was a fisherman who worked on Lake Volta in Ghana. And Kofi didn't end up going to school. This here is an image of Lake Volta. Lake Volta is a huge area of land. It's the large area of water. It was previously land. It was previously forest, which has been flooded. And it's in fact the world's largest man-made lake. And you can see all these trees, half-submerged trees that are poking up through the water because it used to be a forest. And to give a sense of the scale of Lake Volta, Loch Lomond, which I'm sure is a loch that all of us are familiar with, is Lake Volta is 119 times the size of Loch Lomond. So it's a huge body of water, and it's estimated that roughly 10,000 children are held as slaves on Lake Volta. So on Kofi's first day of fishing, he was ordered by his boat master to get into the water, to untie a fishing net which had been caught on one of these partially submerged trees. Kofi jumped in and immediately began swallowing water because no one had ever taught him how to swim. For 2 years, this was Kofi's reality on the lake. Having to fish in dangerous conditions, having to dive down and untangle nets which are caught on trees. So coming back as one for a moment, you might well ask the question the psalmist said, "Why, Lord, do you stand off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" In all honesty, that might be my reaction. That might be your reaction when you hear stories like Kofi's. Or it might be your reaction when you hear that 40.3 million people are held in slavery, like I mentioned earlier. Or it might be your reaction when billions of people in our world live in poverty. Or thinking more of the moment that we find ourselves in just now. This psalm speaks into injustices, but it also says something of the lament or the disorientation that we're feeling at this time. So you might ask, why, Lord, do you stand far off at this time? Why is it that 31,500 people in the UK have died? Why is it that almost 300,000 people in our world have died? Why is it that there's shortages in PPE equipment for our healthcare workers in the UK? Why is it that I'm feeling such anxiety during lockdown when I've never felt it before? Or why is it that I'm not able to see my family at this time? These are all really natural questions and feelings and emotions. And I think this psalm and many other psalms actually prove that it is okay for us to have those questions and to cry out to God in the way that the psalmist does. Lament is an important part of our Christian lives. In a moment of disorientation, when we feel alone or we feel oppressed, we need to keep praying and we need to keep crying out to God. We need to give a spiritual expression to the faith that we have wrestling with the pain that we're seeing in our world and in our lives. We need to be re-energized to call out the injustice in our world and recognize the church's responsibility to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world. Yet it's important to say and to remember and to realize that disorientation is not and should not be the end of our story. In verse 12 to 18, we see the turning point. In verse 12, "Arise, Lord." A declaration from the psalmist that God is powerful to stand against injustice and the difficult situations that we're facing in our world. Verse 14, "But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and you take it in hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the fatherless." This is a reminder from the psalmist of God's character, that God is good, that God is gracious, that God is not a remote God, he is a deeply personal God, and that he is a God of justice. And in verse 16, we see the declaration that the Lord is king forever. And this is both a declaration and an invitation from the psalmist to worship God, despite the situations that we face in our lives and in the world. And just as I come in to close, at IJM, I count it a privilege to work for an organization where lament is a daily activity. And that, on the face of it, sounds a little bit depressing. But that is probably viewing that through the lens the world defines lament as. But biblical lament, as I mentioned at the start, is a crying out to God that is characterized by hopeful expression of trust in his character and in who he is. It's a lament whereby we offer ourselves to God to use to potentially be the answer to our cry that we're crying out with in the first place. By God's grace, IJM, as I mentioned before, has become the world's largest anti-slavery organization. We've seen tens of thousands of people in our world rescued out of slavery and violence because of God working through IJM and working through the church around the world who support our work. One of these people was Kofi, and I want to briefly return to his story as I finish. Working in partnership with the police, we were able to rescue Kofi. This picture in the top left is a picture from the rescue. Our investigators gathered evidence that Kofi and 8 other boys were held in slavery by a particular boat master. And we took this evidence to the police, and we worked with the police in order to rescue these people. Our social workers journeyed with Kofi and continue to journey with Kofi. That's a picture of him in the bottom right in particular. I love that picture. A picture of freedom instead of a picture of oppression. He was provided with food and medicine that he needed. He was enrolled in a school for the first time, and he was reunited with his family. Kofi's future had been stolen from him once, but he is claiming it back. So as I close, in the face of all that's going on in our world just now, the coronavirus pandemic and the injustices that are faced by so many, may we, the church, be the people whose honest cry to God is characterized by a hopeful expression of trust in his character and who he is. Amen. Glenn.
Amen. Andy, thank you so much for that, both for opening the scriptures and for sharing the stories of IJM and what you're about. I wonder if, just as we finish, if like me, everyone's sitting here going, wow, like it's almost a little overwhelming hearing that. What can we do? Is always my instinctive reaction to that. So I wonder, are there ways people can find out more, can get involved, that kind of thing? What could you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I shared a bit in that. I'm just trying to find it. a lament whereby we offer ourselves for God to use to answer our own cry. I believe that God has given us insights, he's given us skills, he's given us talents, he's given us passions in order to come alongside the issues of injustice in our world. So one of the first things I would recommend you to do is to ask yourself the question, what's in my hands? We've all got hands. What's in my hands? What are the skills? What are the passions? What are the burning desires that God has put on my heart to speak into and to do something about? What are the skills, the networks that I am a part of that might be able to support this work? So as a starter, what's in your hands?
Yeah.
Two, I would really invite you to pray with IJM, particularly at this time. Yeah. We're doing a prayer series just now for our prayer partners, which is giving people an insight into the fact that people around the world are actually unsafe in lockdown. Contrary to the hope that you would be more safe being in lockdown, many people in our world are unsafe in lockdown. And we're inviting our prayer partners to intercede. So if you want to become a prayer partner, I'll put up a link, and Glenn can circulate that.
Yeah, we'll send that out. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Finally, the work of Justice at IJM is made possible because of the church around the world who journey with us and support us financially. So there are any number of ways that you can do to support that. I think there's maybe someone in the church who's doing a sponsored cycling ride for IJM. Thank you so much. You can certainly do a whole range of wacky fundraising things. We've got some on our website. But you can also become a Freedom Partner and support us month in, month out as well. So again, I'll share some links with Glenn for that.
Brilliant. And we'll send all those out in the email that we send out this week. A quick note to anyone, if you're not getting our email, let me know and we'll double check that you're on the list properly, and we'll do that. Andy, thank you so much. I'd like to add the IJM, the head of it, Gary Haugens, published a bunch of books. Two that I've found really helpful are Good News About Injustice, which is kind of the first one that tells the story of how IJM was founded. It's a remarkable story of Gary Haugens' journey as an investigator in Rwanda, and how that provoked him to start IJM. It's quite a short read, but brilliant, really, really good. And then he wrote a book a few years ago now called The Locust Effect, which is actually, I've seen recommended by loads of non-Christians actually, as a profoundly significant look at how injustice and poverty and violence are intricately linked, and why if we want to deal with violence, we must deal with poverty. And it's a brilliant book. So I would recommend both those books to us. Again, we'll stick a link in the email this week to both those books. Would you have another book to recommend, or Andy, or either of those two? Or you can't speak. Yeah, you can speak. There you go.
Yeah, well, they're great. So the Good News About Injustice is more explicitly the biblical basis for the work of justice, whereas The Locust Effect is a bit more of an academic look at our model, in order to kind of shift the dial and actually how people come alongside poverty. Broader than that, Tim Keller wrote a book, Generous Justice, a number of years ago, which is a wonderful book that brings together the whole kind of question that people have, you know, what's more important, evangelism, social justice, can they exist together? And Tim Keller says, yes, they can. It's a both and that we need to be doing. So that's been a really helpful book for me in journeying through some of that stuff as well. So I'd recommend that.
Excellent. Thank you. Nick is going to lead us, or going to pray our benediction over us to end today, and then we'll have a chance to be together. Okay. Nick?
So, may God bless you with a restless discomfort about easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may seek truth boldly and love deep within your heart. May God bless you with a holy anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may tirelessly work for justice, freedom, and peace among all people. May God bless you with the gift of tears, to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, or the loss of all that they cherish, so that you may reach out with your hand to comfort them and transform their pain into joy. May God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you really can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, with God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. Amen.